I'm a big fan of Jan Nattier. Back when I was a graduate student, I approached her at a conference and told her so and very nearly asked for her autograph. So what a treat to introduce her this morning. Her scholarship is the sort that shows what's possible. Not only does she explain fundamental moments in the history of Buddhist doctrine, but she uses language and metaphors that make it click. I hear the motto, "a few good men," and I think about those audacious bodhisattvas in the early days of the Mahayana, doing something that no one else could do. Or the phrase job market crowding, and I'm remembering of the proliferation of Pure Lands, how they were needed for the bodhisattva to traverse and complete the path. Professor Nattier works in most of the Buddhist source languages, and she knows well the challenges and pitfalls, not only of the early Buddhist translators, but those who are active today. Professor Nattier, I won't bother you for your autograph, but welcome to the stage.
Well, thank you very much, Alex, for that kind introduction. And I'd also like to thank Marcus Perman for his invitation to be here, and of course the Tsadra Foundation and other sponsors who have made this remarkable gathering possible. It's a very heady experience for me to be in this room in the presence of so many people who are dedicating their efforts to the translation of Buddhist texts. And this is especially so since, as I'm sure you're all aware, the art of translation has fallen on hard times in the academy in the past few decades. More than 20 years ago, when I was an associate professor at Indiana University, my colleague David Haberman and I wrote a short essay entitled, "Whatever Became of Translation?" In it, we argued that the work of translating classical Asian texts deserves a lot more respect than it was getting in the field of religious studies. As translators ourselves, we were in the awkward position of trying to make sure that our graduate students acquired the skills they would need to produce accurate and nuanced translations and interpretations of Hindu and Buddhist texts, respectively. David's a Hinduism specialist. While at the same time, we felt a strong responsibility to make sure the students knew the realities of the field. And that reality was that translation was looked down upon by many of our colleagues. Thus, to submit a translation of a Hindu or Buddhist text as a key part of one's portfolio for tenure or promotion could be disastrous. By way of warning, we used to tell them the story of a search committee meeting, not at Indiana, but at another large large state university, where a senior professor in religious studies at the search committee meeting grabbed one of the candidates' books, hoisted it in the air, waved it around, and said, "This isn't a book, it's a translation." That gives you an idea of the status of translation in our field at that time. Now, having lived and worked outside the United States for most of the past decade, I'm not entirely sure whether things have gotten better or worse, and I would very much appreciate your comments on that if we have time to discuss it in the question period. But in any case, I'm not going to try to use my time today to try to persuade you of the value of translation. That would surely be preaching to the choir, as the expression goes, or to translate English into English, trying to convert the already converted. So I'm not going to spend my time doing that in my comments today. But I do just want to begin simply by noting that in my view, and I'm sure it's a view that is widely shared in this room, the translation of religious texts is one of the most difficult tasks and one of the most important contributions that we as scholars of Buddhism can possibly undertake. So for someone like myself, it is indeed a very great pleasure to be here. Now, at this conference, most of the presentations and discussions, in one way or another, have dealt and will deal with how we, as 21st century Westerners, can best go about translating texts, in particular Buddhist texts. And more specifically, of course, the discussions have been centered around the challenges of working with texts in Tibetan. What I would like to do in my talk this morning is different from this in at least two respects. First of all, I would like to focus on Chinese rather than Tibetan Buddhist texts, discussing scriptures that began to be translated already in the middle of the 2nd century of the Common Era. And second, rather than focusing primarily on how we might go about translating texts like these, although I will say some things about that toward the end, what I would like to do here is to look, so to speak, over the shoulders of these translators, who I really think of as our ancestors in the business of translation. The lineages are not direct, of course, but these are our predecessors. These are the people who were, in fact, pioneers in trying to take Buddhist teachings and transform them into a completely different language from many of the Indian languages in which they had circulated. So I'd like to take a look at how these early translators actually did their work. But to talk about the translation methods used by our predecessors in China, we must first have some understanding of the nature of the sources from which they worked. So in the first part of my talk, I will actually spend time with some observations about the Buddhist scriptures that were circulating in India itself. And I immediately have to stop and problematize the word scripture, because as you know, etymologically, that implies writing. And as you also know very well, in the early centuries, Buddhist sacred texts were circulated orally only for several centuries. That's something I'll have more to say about later on. So I want to begin by some observations about the sacred texts circulating in India during the lifetime of the Buddha and afterwards. And then with this general picture as background, we'll be in a far better position to place the work of these pioneering Chinese translators in a proper context. It's also my hope that, even though I'll be focusing on these Indian and then Chinese Buddhist texts, that these remarks may help also to contextualize the distinctiveness of what took place several centuries later in Tibet. I should point out at the beginning that on the handout, which I believe you have, there is a correction, basically. There's a typesetting error in the program, which says, from Gandhari to Pali to Han-Dynasty Chinese. I don't know how one would get from Gāndhārī to Pali. It was supposed to be and that is on the handout. So if any of you formed an idea of this talk from the program rather than the handout, change that word, and it will make a lot more sense. So the title is The Proto-History of Buddhist Translation, from Gandhari and Pali to Han-Dynasty Chinese. And if you're not a Gandhari wala, you're not familiar with that, don't panic. I'm hoping to unpack that, as well as some perhaps little-known facts about the Pali side of things as well, before moving on to China to describe what went on there. So one reason for focusing on the beginnings of Buddhist translation in China is that it was here, in the northern capital of Luoyang, in the middle of the 2nd century of the Common Era, that we see the first known examples of the translation of Buddhist scriptures into a non-Indian tone. But as soon as we raise the question of what the translators were working from, we are immediately forced to deal with the fact that the translation of Buddhist scriptures did not actually begin in China. Instead, it had already begun several centuries earlier, in all probability during the lifetime of the Buddha himself. This part of the story is rarely told, and much of it has only come into clearer scholarly focus within the past few decades. So it's worth pausing to take a close look at what is known about the early history of Buddhist translation in India itself, before moving on to consider the very different case of China. To begin at the beginning, we will have to ask some very basic questions. For example, what language did the Buddha speak? That's pretty basic. Now, if you ask a pious Theravada Buddhist today, if you ask one of my neighbors in Thailand, they'll be eager and quick to reply, he spoke Pali. And for them, the name Magadhi, the language of the Magadha area where he lived and did most of his teaching, is a synonym for Pali. In other words, they understand the two to be equivalent. But as we shall see, things are certainly not so simple. To begin with what we do know, it's well established that the Buddha lived in the northeastern part of the Indian subcontinent, having been born in what today is southern Nepal, and that he spent most of his teaching career in the region known as Magadha. So it does seem reasonable to suppose, as specialists do, that most of his teachings were initially delivered in some form of what more technically is called Old Magadhi, and it's referred to as old to distinguish it from Ardha Magadhi, a much later language that was used for the transmission of scriptures belonging to the Jain tradition. But Old Magadhi was far from the only language spoken in India, or even in northern India at the time. And it seems likely that the Buddha may have been able to communicate in more than one language, as K.R. Norman had suggested in one of the articles that's in the list of references on your handout. So it's worth, okay, so there were also, in addition to this Old Magadhi, there were many other languages that scholars refer to as Prakrits. This is the first term on your handout here. It's a term that's used to refer to vernacular, that is spoken, Middle Indic languages, in contrast to the language of Sanskrit. Middle Indic is also referred to by some Indologists as Middle Indo-Iranian. So these are the same thing for our purposes. So I want to just call your attention to the actual meaning of Prakrit and how it's related to Sanskrit. If you look on the handout, as you know, Prakrita is can be defined as natural or unrefined, or we might even say unvarnished. Prakriti, of course, is a very famous word in Indian philosophy. And the contrast here is with Sanskrit, which is Samskrita, which is surely a word that you all know, but in different contexts. In this context, we might say it means put together, in the sense of almost decorated, made beautiful. Now, it sounds from that pair of terms as though what we're talking about is Prakrits being made into Sanskrit. And that did happen later in Indian Buddhist history. We have early texts composed in Prakrits. The oral teachings were surely in Prakrit languages, local vernaculars. And then over the course of time, again, I'm sure this is familiar to most or all of you, Sanskrit became more and more the language of choice for the transmission of Buddhist texts. So by the time the Tibetans received this tradition, Sanskrit appeared to be the normal Buddhist language. But things were much more diverse in the early period. And let me just call your attention to how weird this situation is. The Prakrits are the daughter languages of Sanskrit. Prakrit is to Sanskrit as the Romance languages, for example, are to Latin. So Sanskrit is older as a language, but newer as a language of transmission of Buddhist texts. It's as if the early Christian teachings were in French, well, this is obviously anachronistic, but as if they were in French and Italian and Spanish, and later were put into Latin. So there's something interestingly backward about what happened language-wise in the history of Indian Buddhism. So what I'm going to be talking about at the beginning of this talk are these offspring languages of Sanskrit, different types of Prakrits that were spoken in different parts of India, especially northern India at this time. So in this talk, I'm going to be saying quite a bit about what I will call translation policy. What kinds of choices do we, and what kinds of choices did these ancestors of ours make in how to go about translating a Buddhist text? And I should mention, because this will come up later when we look at the broad cultural history of Buddhist translation, there's a prior question. Should we translate at all? Or should we all just learn Tibetan and recite and study the text in Tibetan? Or should we all just learn Pali and recite and study the text in Pali? It does not go without saying, in any particular culture, that the translation of the canon is even going to be undertaken. So that is the prior decision. Do we translate? Or do we keep the sacred texts in their original language? The second big decision, once you've taken the side of, yes, let's translate, is, of course, how to do that, how to go about that. And that's really what I mean by translation policy, which I'll be talking about a lot today. So it's worth pausing at the beginning of this discussion to look at the translation policy that is attributed to the Buddha himself. In an account contained in the Vinaya, not only in Pali, but also in Vinayas belonging to a number of different ordination lineages, as I often translate this word, Nikaya, sometimes called schools, but groups that had their own Vinaya, groups that could ordain people as monastics in India. So in the Pali lineage, the lineage that uses the Pali language that comes to be known as Theravada in the modern world, but also in the Vinayas belonging to a number of other Nikayas or ordination lineages, we find an account of what the Buddha had to say about this. And because it's spread across these canons, Pache Gregory Chopin, I believe this does indicate that it's old. Gregory sometimes argues that where canons agree, that means one borrowed from another. There are such cases, but by and large, I think we're looking at a kind of stemma situation where there's a shared tradition that is passed on through these different Nikayas. And if it's shared across a broad range of canons, that probably points to its antiquity. Again, this is an issue that if you'd like to talk more about that in the question period, I would be very happy to do so. So what in this story, we actually get a very clear-cut account of what the Buddha's own translation policy was said to be. Immensely valuable passage. So in this story, the Buddha is portrayed as opposing the formalized recitation of his teachings in anything other than the local vernacular. No formalized language used the local speech. According to this tale, there were two Brahmin brothers who had been converted to Buddhism, and they were concerned, as good Brahmins might be, that monks, quote, of a variety of origins and family backgrounds, unquote, were corrupting the word of the Buddha by reciting his teachings, each in their own way. Let us remedy the situation, the brothers suggested to the Buddha, by putting the words of the Buddha into chandas. Now, there was some talk yesterday about what you can't translate, what you maybe shouldn't translate. I've left this word chandas in italics in the written version, as you can guess, because the precise meaning of the word has been a topic of quite a bit of controversy. But we can say that in general terms, it is associated with the style of recitation used for Vedic texts. That is, the religious literature with which the brothers would have been most familiar. And let me just remind you that what's really remarkable about the Vedic texts for scholars of languages, for Indologists especially, is that these were passed down orally for, not for centuries, for millennia, in an ancient language that was no longer spoken even by these Brahmin brothers. In other words, they were reciting classical texts when they were taught Vedic scriptures. And yet, that memorization tradition was such that every syllable could be preserved, which is why modern scholars can actually find out from these sources, now, which are now written, what Vedic Sanskrit was like, and talk about the evolution of this language. So the brothers seem to have been arguing for doing something more elegant, more standardized, more familiar with the Buddhist teachings. So there wouldn't be, to paraphrase their apparent opinions, there wouldn't be all these riffraff with their local accents and local dialects messing up this important stuff. So the Buddha's response to this, whatever exactly is the nuance of this word chandas, and I'll send you to the work by Fondy Neuber and K.R. Norman that's on the list of references if you want to know more about this. The Buddha's response to the brothers' suggestion is not at all ambiguous. He forbids the recitation of his teachings in chandas, whether that means versified fancy text or whether it means actual Vedic language, whatever it is, he forbid that. But then he says, instructing his followers, teach the word of the Buddha, each in your own language. So as far back as we can go in the sources that are available to us, the translation policy attributed to the Buddha himself, you can't get much more authoritative than that, the translation policy was teach in whatever the local people will understand. use the vernacular, or to put it in Indian terms, use the Prakrit languages. And that is exactly what the Buddhists seem to have done in these early centuries. As I've already mentioned, there were many different Prakrits being used in different parts of India. And this is not just something that we can imagine based on the trajectory from the Sanskrit texts into modern spoken, I suppose you could sort of call them Prakrits, but we don't, Hindi and Urdu and so forth. There were many different Prakrits in India, and we can actually obtain some concrete information about what they were like from the inscriptions of King Ashoka, who had messages to his subjects, PR pieces, you could say, carved on stone and erected throughout his realm. And as you'll recall, Ashoka inherited a great empire already, the Mauryan Empire, but expanded it to include virtually the whole of the Indian subcontinent. The largest unified empire until the coming of the British in India. After the end of the Mauryan Empire, of course, things split up into smaller, still substantial, but smaller units. So Ashoka controlled a huge amount of territory. And his inscriptions have been found in a huge amount of that territory as well. Normally, when you talk about Ashoka, you dive right into the content and what a wonderful king he was and how he gave up violence when he became a Buddhist, and that's all immensely important and irrelevant to us here. What we want to know is what languages were those inscriptions in? And this is where scholars can use this material because they are in a variety of Prakrits and even in some non-Indian languages. Ashoka's realm extended up into what today is Pakistan and even eastern Afghanistan. And in these regions, maybe some of you know this, but I still think this is amazing. There were inscriptions carved in Aramaic and Greek, as well as in Prakrit. Now, that sounds really bizarre, especially the Aramaic part. This is the language Jesus spoke. It's a Semitic language from the Middle East. What's it doing in Ashoka's realm? Well, it seems very odd until we remember that Aramaic had been used as the language of civil administration by the Achaemenid Persian Empire. That's why it was there. This is the remains of a Persian practice. Persian, of course, being Indo-European, using a completely unrelated language for their civil administration, their written communications. The use of Greek, of course, is part of the legacy of Alexander the Great, who invaded this region, dying about a century before the time of King Ashoka. So those are bizarre and wonderful examples, the Aramaic and Greek, and there's even bilingual ones, and they can be compared to the Prakrit to help translate one another. It's a very rich corpus of multilingual material. But for our purposes this morning, one of the most invaluable legacies of King Ashoka is that his inscriptions have allowed scholars to map out the variety of different Prakrits spoken on the Indian subcontinent during his time. So just staying with northern India, which is the area we're concerned with right now, it's possible to distinguish the linguistic and phonological features of Eastern versus Western Prakrits in the middle of the 3rd century. So depending on whether you use the short chronology or the long chronology, a century or two after the time of the Buddha. So back to my Theravadan friends. Where does Pali fit into this picture? It's certainly to be classified as one of the many Middle Indic languages. It belongs to that general territory, linguistically. And thus, in a certain sense, it's a Prakrit. But when we map Pali onto the picture provided by the Ashokan inscriptions, we, or rather Indological specialists, discover something very peculiar. For Pali does not fit the normal profile of an ordinary Prakrit. Instead, as the great Pali scholar Oskar von Neuber has shown, it exhibits a mixture of Eastern and Western features, including some terminology that's thought to go back to Old Magadhi itself, even older language. The majority of the characteristics of Pali, in fact, line up with what we know from the inscriptions would be Western Prakrits, not Eastern. And this already would call into question whether it was anything close to the language the Buddha spoke, since the Buddha lived and taught in the eastern part of this region. But it's a mixture. It contains some Eastern and a majority of Western Prakritic features. Pali is, in other words, a hybrid language containing a peculiar mixture of dialectal forms. Now, I'm not going to go into all the Indological minutiae here, so cut to the chase, but to sum up the work of von Hinuber and others, this fact of the hybridity of Pali has some striking implications. As I've said, it's clear that it was not the language the Buddha spoke. But not only did the Buddha not speak Pali, no one spoke Pali. Pali is, as von Hinuber calls it, an artificial language, cobbled together from a variety of spoken languages to come up with what von Hinuber called, I'm not sure it was the best choice, but he called it a lingua franca for the purpose of disseminating Buddhist teachings across dialectal or perhaps language lines. So it's a compromise language made up of pieces from different languages in India at the time. The reason I have trouble with lingua franca is usually that means something you can speak. Usually that it can be a marketplace language where people from different linguistic backgrounds can haggle over goods in some common tongue. And that's not what Pali was. It's a scriptural lingua franca. I don't think we really have a word for that. But used originally and only for religious texts. And I mean that broadly, not only for the canonical scriptures attributed to the Buddha, but later for commentaries and for what we might call church histories, texts like the Dīpavamsa from the 3rd or 4th century, or the Mahavamsa from the 5th century, composed to tell the history of Buddhism and, of course, the history of Sri Lanka in the process, composed in Sri Lanka much later. So Pali is already representing a bit of a divergence from the language policy we talked about at the beginning. It's no one's language, and ideally everyone's language, at least as a language for the study and recitation of Buddhist texts. So it might be a language of compromise, would be another way to put it. Now, for our purposes, again, there's another rather surprising implication of this, maybe even shocking to some people, and that is that the texts in Pali cannot in any sense be described as the originals. When I say shocking to some people, I mean, again, a lot of my Theravadan friends who consider this the real Buddha Vachana. This is what he said, and it's in the language that he said it. That would be nice. We have no podcasts, alas, from the Buddha. But in terms of a conference devoted to translation, what this means is the texts in Pali are not original teachings in anyone's dialect. They are translations, or at least transpositions into different wording using various Prakrit elements. What term we should use for this is a little tricky, but I think as a default, we could say they're translations. If you accept that word for translation from one very closely related dialect to another, the tasks are much easier, obviously, than if you're translating from an Indian language into Tibetan or Chinese. But it's a kind of translation even there. So already with Pali, we see evidence of the change of religious texts from one or probably many different languages being used for this, even in the region of northeastern India, into a fixed scriptural language. And here, again, I'd like to ask you to look at the handout. The word Pali is the subject of a very old misunderstanding, not ours. We inherited it. This is a misunderstanding in medieval Asian traditions. The word doesn't appear in the Pali Tripitaka. It's a commentarial word. It comes from a later layer of Buddhist literature. And when it does appear, it's the phrase that it appears in is Pali Bhasa. Well, you know Bhasha, Subhashita, and so forth. Just the Pali language. So it looks like the name of a language, like the French language, or the Sanskrit language, or the Chinese language. but it's not. Pali, as I think some of you already know, doesn't mean a language name, it means texts. Specifically, it means scriptural, religious texts, not necessarily written down. So Pali Bahasa is the language of the texts, which again reminds us this is not a spoken vernacular. This is a textual language created for a very specific purpose. So at some point, von Hinuber has traced this. I believe K.R. Norman has also talked about it. Asian Buddhists began to misunderstand this also as the name of a language. They forgot that Pali meant texts and a particular kind of text, and they began to take it in parallel to other such expressions as the name of the language itself. If the language had had a name, it would probably have been Buddhist hybrid Prakrit or something of that sort. So when these oral traditions were transposed or translated into Pali, this is hardly the kind of linguistic task or the dramatic change that we see in, for example, the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, the Septuagint, or the transfer of the teachings of early Christians from Aramaic again into Koine Greek, spoken Greek, the New Testament. But where these are shifts from one language family to another, within India, what we're seeing is shifts among Prakrits, shifts from one Middle Indic language to another, as Buddhism extended into further regions. So when did Pali become a church language? We don't know exactly. It's impossible to give this a specific date. But there's one very important benchmark in the history of the Pali tradition, and that is that the Pali scriptures were written down toward the end of the 1st century of the Common Era, sometime during the 20s, we're told in a later traditional source. Why were they written down? This was done in Sri Lanka. The usual argument has been that there was a fear that as long as the tradition is oral, if the last monk who can recite the Digha Nikaya dies in a famine, you've lost it. If there's famine, if there's civil war, if there's an epidemic, and your tradition is dependent on the living memory of people reciting these texts, that could be the end of the line for part or all of your canon, ultimately. So that's the normal reason that's given for this. Steve Collins, more recently, has argued that this was actually an intra-Nikaya feuding, and that those who wrote these Pali texts down were trying to get an upper hand in the battle. Well, they certainly did. The Pali tradition has grown larger than life in its impact in the contemporary world and in the intervening centuries. But be that as it may, what I want to call your attention to here is what a radical departure this is from earlier Buddhist practice. Not only Buddhist practice, but religious practice throughout India. Sacred texts were not written down. You're familiar with how the Vedic tradition was memorized and passed down orally. But it's not simply that they were good at this. It is, on the one hand, that if you pass it down orally, you can determine very specifically who gets access. And not everyone was eligible to get access to the Vedic text. So you can keep a kind of esoteric aspect to the transmission if you do this. You know, you don't lose the text and some unqualified person picks it up and reads it, finds it. But more than this, there's a fascinating passage in a Vedic text, a later Vedic text, the Aitareya Aranyaka, that actually describes a list of things that disqualify you for performing Vedic rituals. In other words, you have to go and purify yourself before you can then enter this sacred realm. And the list has a lot of stuff that we would expect: touching a corpse, coming into contact with blood, having sexual intercourse. That, if you're taking an SAT exam, those things in this context can go together. But the next one is writing. And just to cover all the bases, or erasing writing. All of these were considered polluting activities from a Brahmanical Vedic perspective. Now that tells you something about how appalling it would have been to write down the Vedas or the Upanishads, or for anyone who is part of this world to think about taking a sacred text and putting it into writing. I'd love to know more about what's said about the impurity of writing in this period. I haven't been able to track down much information on that, but I haven't spent a lot of time trying to do it. The Aitareya Aranyaka is quite unambiguous about this being a polluting activity. So I just want to underscore, before I go into the next prakrit that I want to talk about, what an amazing divergence, deviation, we should really say, from Indian common practice this was, to write down the sacred texts of Buddhism. Note where it took place. Did not take place in Magadha. Did not take place in Madhya Desha, the central area. It did not take place on the subcontinent. It took place in Sri Lanka, far from the Brahmanical heartland, out of the area where those constraints would have been fully in place. So I think that's interesting. And it becomes more interesting when we look at the other place that we know of Buddhist texts being written down. Amazingly, it's at about the same time, in the 1st century BCE, and at the complete opposite end of the Indian subcontinent, that is, in northern Pakistan and southern Afghanistan. And that language is the Gandhari language. This region was known as Gandhara. You can find some wonderful things about that. In a good introduction is the work by Rich Solomon, who's really the father of Gandhari studies in the contemporary period, an immensely talented and wonderful scholar. His book is a nice introduction for non-specialists if you want to find out about these manuscripts. I'm sure you've all heard about them, but I want to say a couple of things about what's distinctive about this. For Pali, we have legend, tradition, history maybe, the story of the writing down of the canon in the 1st century BCE. The manuscripts that are available are well over 1,000 years later. There are 2 pages, apparently, from the 8th to 9th century that were found in Nepal. Otherwise, it's mostly from the 15th century onward. And von Niebuhr points out, the climate is a factor. Things don't survive so well if they're not buried in a desert or somewhere at least a little colder and less humid. But for Pali, that's likely that that's when it happened. It seems a realistic tradition. For Gandhari, we have 1st century BCE manuscripts, carbon dated to that old. These are the oldest Indian manuscripts, not carvings on stone, the oldest Indian literary text, we could say, written on birch bark. That was the medium of choice in this area, and in the Gandhari language. So we have actual physical evidence of Buddhist sacred texts being circulated in writing at the other end of the Indian cultural sphere. So Gandhari is another prakrit. It's from this area where Greek and Aramaic were being used. And interestingly enough, it's written in a script derived from Aramaic. It's written from right to left. But it's a Middle Indic language, it's a prakrit. So it's a cousin of Pali, but very, very different, obviously a Northwestern style of prakrit. And here, in the case of both Pali and Gandhari, we can see that the texts as we have them are translations. In Gandhari, there are words that came over in forms that aren't allowable in Gandhari. Von Niebuhr has pointed out the same thing with Pali. So we can see kind of traces of what these might have come from. So it's a remarkable picture. These are the only 2 prakrits for which we have concrete evidence that they were written down in the Indian cultural sphere. And as we'll see, they both spread way outside their home turf. So the Pali story is fairly straightforward. From Sri Lanka, it eventually gets exported to Southeast Asia and becomes the church language there. The Gandhari story is becoming clearer in recent years with research by Solomon and his students and colleagues showing more and more evidence that the early textual tradition arriving in China may not have been by any means exclusively Gandhari, but certainly there's a lot of evidence that some of the texts were in Gandhari. Some of the others may have been oral. We know there's a mixture of oral and written material coming to China. So sometimes we can see in Chinese translations concrete evidence, like a transcription in a certain pronunciation of a term, that points to Gandhari and doesn't line up with other Prakrits. So one of the minor growth industries in Buddhist studies is trying to figure out, in the case of particular texts, what was this translated from? It's an enormously technical business, but it can be done. So there are some Buddhist translations that very specifically we can say this shows evidence of having been done on the basis of a Gandhari prototype. So we have Pali going out from Southeast Asia, from Sri Lanka to Southeast Asia, obviously by the sea route, basically, and then in the northwest, Gandhari making its way along the Silk Road to China. And there have been texts, as I said, found in Pakistan and Afghanistan in recent years, but already almost a century ago, we had evidence of Gandhari from eastern Central Asia, that is the Tarim Basin, the southern part of what's now Xinjiang in the People's Republic of China. One of those being Gandhari Dharmapada, version of the Dhammapada. So it's clear that Buddhist texts were being exported through this region to China. So Pali and Gandhari, that's what we know about of languages in which Buddhist literature was transmitted and written down. And there's probably a connection. The fact that it was written down has helped a lot to preserve these outside India. And the fact then that they were exported beyond their native region meant that other cultures kept them alive when Buddhism in some of these areas began to die out. So again, at the extremes of the Indic cultural sphere. What should be my target stopping time? Okay, right, thank you. I was kind of assuming that, but I could have asked you before and forgot. So thank you. Okay, so coming into China, we have evidence of an awareness of Buddhism already in the first century in secular sources. History and poetry mention this Buddhist monks and so forth. But the translation of Buddhist texts began in the middle of the 2nd century. And I'd like to turn front and center now to the story of the beginnings of Buddhist translation into languages other than the language of India. And it's a remarkable account. It's just one of the amazing things in cultural transmission in world history. So if we look at the handout here, one last thing I wanted to note, the Sanskrit word pustaka, in Pali it's potaka, you've probably seen it in the form poti somewhere. If you look this up in Meyerhofer's very funnily titled book, it's 4 volumes and it's called the, Kurzgefasste, the brief dictionary. Only in German does that make sense, that 4 volumes can be brief. So if you look up pustaka there, Meyerhofer says this appears to be, and I think it's now pretty clear that it is, an Iranian loanword in Sanskrit. It's a word that appears first in Buddhist literature, and mainly in Buddhist literature, and is used for a category that didn't exist in India before, that is, written religious texts. They didn't have anything to call them. They didn't have a word scripture, which I've been throwing around a little bit here. So they needed a word, and they called them pustaka. So if you read those passages in, for instance, the 8,000-line perfection of wisdom, the Ashtasasrika Pranyoparamita, about writing the text, it's the word they use there is make it into a book, make it into a pustaka when you write it down. Now here's the weird thing. Guess what pustaka means, or what the Iranian antecedent of it means? Does anybody know? It means leather. Leather? Or Meyerhofer has another word that translates as hides. Iranians wrote on hides, cowhides. Traditionally, the Zoroastrian scriptures were recorded on cowhide. So this was a writing material in that part of the world. So a pustika was something on hide. Now, the Buddhists did not follow in those footsteps. They did not write their scriptures on hide. As I mentioned, in the Northwest, they wrote them on birch bark. In Sri Lanka, they wrote them on palm leaves, as they did in the Indian mainland. But this is a really good example of how foreign that concept was. They had to borrow a word that meant something as bizarre as leather, but probably was forgotten quite quickly in India. Borrow a word from the Iranian cultural sphere, from their neighbors, just slightly to the north. Okay, so let's take a look at translation of Buddhist scriptures in China. There's a wonderful article, it was actually just a public lecture, not a scholarly article originally, by the scholar J.W. de Jong, who taught for years at Australian National University. And he periodized, based on some work also done by Chinese scholars before him, periodized the place of origin of Buddhist translators in China. And what he found was very interesting. He divided it into three periods. This is on your handout under Buddhist translators in China. The first period, from the middle of the 2nd century until roughly the middle of the 3rd, most of the translators were from what the Chinese called the Western regions, and this basically translates into Central Asia. More specifically, I'll add, they were from Western Central Asia, not from China's immediate neighbors, Eastern Central Asia, but from the far west. I'll say more about their ethnicity in a minute. From the second period, and you have this on your handout, so I'll just pass through this quickly. The second period, the majority were from Kashmir. It's only in the third period, starting in the late 5th century, that we begin to see the majority of foreign translators coming from India itself, the Indian subcontinent, not from Kashmir or Central Asia. So the story we have of Indian missionaries going to China, if we have that in our heads, does not line up with what the sources actually tell us. So in the first period, we're looking at translators coming from Central Asia. So who were these guys? Very quickly, looking at their ethnic backgrounds. We can tell this because in China, something called an ethnicon, a surname that reflects your ethnicity, was added. It would be as if somebody's name was Joseph French, meaning that his ancestors were French. So if someone's name is An, that means that their ancestry is Parthian. It comes from Arsacid. Some of you, Nathan Hill and others, will be able to explain why R gets transcribed as An in this period. Take it on faith, if you would, at the moment, and ask Nathan for details. The second group that we see, besides Parthians, has a surname of Jur, which stands for Yuezhur. This is a people whose language we can't pin down. They're a nomadic people who originally lived up in the area of Mongolia and migrated in the 2nd century BCE far to the west and became major players in the Kushan Empire. So when we see this, they could be speakers of Bactrian, which, like Parthian, is a Middle Iranian language. So we've talked about Middle Indic, now we're into Middle Iranian. But that's not 100% sure. But in any case, skipping over the problems of the multiple Yuezhur, ask me about it later if you want, all of these groups appear to have come from Western Central Asia. So we can assume that these are the so-called greater Yuezhur that became rulers in the Kushan period. And then finally, the surname Kang for Sogdian. This is in what's modern Uzbekistan. So another Middle Iranian language. So Iranians are everywhere on the ground floor of Chinese Buddhist translation. There are two things that I want to call your attention to with respect to this very brief list of these three dominant ethnicities among the early translators. And I'm really talking about 2nd and beginning of the 3rd century here. That's as far as I'll really be able to get in this talk today. From this period, we have no Buddhist texts in Parthian, no Buddhist texts in Bactrian, or whatever else Yuezhur might have been, and no Buddhist texts in Sogdian. 0. In fact, we don't have any Buddhist texts in any Central Asian language, and at the moment I'm using this for Silk Road, not for Tibet, because of the historical time frame here. No Buddhist texts in any Central Asian language until centuries after they had begun to be translated into Chinese. What we find, if we dig into the sands of the Tarim Basin, are texts in Gandhari, and then later in Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit, and then later than that in more classical Sanskrit. So it looks like what was happening was Buddhism across Central Asia was being transmitted not in the local vernaculars, according to the Buddha's original translation policy, but in a church language, an Indian language, which was not the language of the native people. So this was a little more of a stretch from Middle Indic to Middle Iranian. Still, we're in Indo-European territory until we get to the borders of China. And then we're in a different situation. Crossing into the borders, when we talk about these Central Asian translators, the second point I'd like to call to your attention, besides the absence of Buddhist texts in their own languages, presence only in Indian ones as far as we know, is that this means they were not native speakers of either the source language or the target language. This sounds like a recipe for disaster. It was a recipe for very clunky style. I'm going to say a little about what these texts are like to read, but the level of accuracy, when we can compare them to existing texts in Pali or later in Sanskrit, or when we can compare them to other Chinese language translations made later when knowledge was at a higher level, they did remarkably well. They made some mistakes. Most of the mistakes, I think, most of the huge mistakes were made later, not in the 3rd century and early 4th century. There's a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of work on these texts by people who did not come from the West at all, who grew up in China and tried to deal with these things and didn't always do so well on the South Asian side, the Indic side. Their Chinese was better than their source language. So who are these guys? And here we're going to go straight into their translation policies. Translators active in Luoyang, the Chinese capital in the north, during the 2nd century of the Common Era, and what they translated. The first historically known translator, the real pioneer of Chinese Buddhist translation, is a guy named An Shigao, who, I've given you his dates here, exclusively non-Mahayana texts, and where the background of these can be identified, they seem consistently to be Sarvastivadin. It appears, and I'm emphasizing appears, we don't have concrete evidence, that he brought these with him. And that's one thing that explains the coherence of the body of material that he translated. It also appears, and this is a little less certain, it appears that he worked mainly alone. He had lived in China for many years before the texts were produced, so he could have acquired a modicum of spoken Chinese. They are anything but elegant. They are clunky. They sometimes reproduce not sometimes, they do often reproduce Indian word order, sticking a vocative in the middle of a sentence. Here, O Shariputra, you can see that this is not good Chinese style. No one would say that they're elegant. And when he came to verses in the Indian originals, good old An Shigao, I have the feeling if we could bring him here to interview, which would be a dream come true, you would find he'd fit in very well in this crowd, that he thought a lot. Not because he was clunky, let me emphasize, but because he thought seriously about what to do with these texts in making this huge leap from at least things in Middle Indic vernaculars into Chinese. And one place we can see him in action is when he encountered verses in the Indic text. What do you do when you come up to a verse? Well, he said, the following is in gatas. He used a transcription of the word gata, meaning verse, in Indian languages. And then he translates in prose. He's not a literary man. He has no Chinese literary education. No doubt, when I say it appears he worked alone, probably he had help from scribes, but this stuff was not getting filtered through the knowledge of well-educated Chinese literati. It comes out reading kind of kerchunk, kerchunk, kerchunk. But you can tell, well, after a few years of studying it, you can tell what's going on in this very unusual kind of Buddhist Chinese. But remarkably careful. And so far as we can tell, very few things that we would really call errors. There are things that are obscure to us, but you don't catch the guy asleep at the wheel often at all. So there's our very first Chinese translator, a Parthian who favored the Sarvastivadin tradition, did not ever translate anything Mahayana, and was anything but elegant in his style. Second one, Lokakshema. This one, a descendant of the Yuezhi. He has that Jur ethnicon surname. Kind of fill in the space. The Chinese were supposed to have surnames, at least if they had some status, and so that becomes his surname. In his case, we have evidence that he worked with groups, that he worked with shifting translation committees, multilingual, multi-ethnic groups. Again, mostly Central Asian with some Chinese involved. And his text could not be more different. An Chigao's translation policy, let me say before I compare it to Lokakshema, was pretty much what Professor Bellows told us yesterday you should do, transcribe the names and translate everything else. In other words, proper names by An Chigao were generally transcribed according to their sounds. Everything else, including Buddhist technical terminology, karma, dharma, nirvana, all of that stuff, he generally translated into Chinese words. Very simple ones, nothing fancy, nothing elegant and literary. Lokakshema took a very different policy, very different tack. What he did in his group was to use an enormous amount of long, unwieldy transcriptions, 7, 8, 9 Chinese characters. This is not good Chinese style. In fact, when I used to read some of these texts with graduate students, native speakers of Chinese at Indiana, and we'd look at Lokakshema, there was one case where he actually, there are several of these that are of comparable length, but Supreme Perfect Awakening, or variously translated, Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi, he transcribed it. And these Chinese native speakers they didn't even want to read it out loud. They'd just go, that word. It's horrifying, this kind of style. He was clearly, if we think about he and his committees, who their target audience might have been, it was surely somewhat similar, I would guess, to the makeup of his translation committees. Multi-ethnic, mostly Indo-European background with some Chinese hangers-on and aficionados, who had a large tolerance for long transcribed foreign words. At least he hoped. And some of his material did become quite popular. An Chigao's as well. I'll come back to that issue in my closing words. But let me then call your attention to the next virtually simultaneous translators. Here we have a team of 2, not a big committee, not a guy working in his study by himself, but 2 people, a Parthian layman and a Chinese monk, bracketing all the questions about what's the status of ordination in China at this time. Did they really have a full sangha? Could you be a bhikshu or not? Yanfo Tiao is described as a monk, perhaps a novice, but in any case a renunciant, where An Chuan was a Parthian merchant. And the 2 worked together with a completely opposite translation policy to what we see in Lokakshema. No transcriptions whatsoever, with, I believe, one exception, the name of Ananda, which does come out as Anan, which is already set in this time. All other proper names they translate. I've given you an example or 2 here. Shravasti, that was the one that's most noteworthy because it will resonate a little bit with what you see in Tibetan. Apparently what they did was they parsed it as Shrav, coming from Shru, that it was something about hearing. And then they took the latter part, Vasti, as if it were Vastu, apparently, thing or object. So it's like heard things that are heard. Where in Tibetan, the Asti comes out as Yur, right? Existing. When they do the Nyenyo is the translation of Shravasti in Tibetan. It's again an etymological translation. That's what they do throughout this text. Aside from Ananda, all the names, all the terms, including Bhagavan, including Nirvana, place names, people names, everything. It's all put into Chinese. Is it beautiful? No, not even remotely. Whatever Yan Fotiao was, he was not somebody with a great literary background, or if he did, he hid it very well. It's not always easy to read. This is the one text that they have. It's a Mahayana sutra. And again, Lokakshema and his group preferred only all Mahayana all the time. There is no evidence of elegance until we get to the very end of the Han Dynasty, possibly after the time that the capital had been basically evacuated and people were living in another location. Given the dates, Antonello Palumbo is working on this issue about how we should stratify translations produced during the very end of the Han. Here we have our first Sogdian, but he's not from Sogdiana. He's not from the homeland. He's born and raised in China. And finally, we get something that the great sinologist and Buddhologist Eric Zerker was willing to describe as elegant. A biography of the Buddha, of which about half survives unrevised. The other half survives in a revised form that's from a later stratum of Buddhist Chinese. So here we have 3 translators and groups of translators who produced very unbeautiful translations, and one who produced a nice literary work. What was their fate? What happened to these things afterwards? It may be a bit surprising, but they were all wildly popular. An Shugao's clunky translations received praise as excellent from native speakers, educated Chinese in subsequent centuries. They were taught, they were remembered, they were copied, commentaries were written on them by, again, native speakers of Chinese. They had an immense impact from the north on to the south, where they were eventually exported. Lokakshema's convoluted texts, bristling with these long transcriptions, also had a big impact. I'm not sure you can say they were popular in the same way. They raised doubts, and I'm thinking specifically about his translation of the 8,000-line Perfection of Wisdom. People said, this doesn't make sense. We can't understand this. There must be a better version of the text. And so the famous story of Chinese going off to Khotan to try to find what they believed was the original, that is a larger Prajnaparamita. The idea at this point was that the Ashtasasrika, the 8,000 line, was an abbreviation. And that was the problem, they thought. That's why we can't understand Lokakshema. Parts of it are understandable. I think it'd be hard to parse how much was trouble understanding the Perfection of Wisdom, the Prajnaparamita, and how much was trouble understanding Lokakshema. But there was trouble, that's clear. And yet, these texts, again, had a huge impact, stimulating all kinds of Chinese reflection on the ideas of emptiness and so forth, that resonated down through the centuries. An Xuan and Yan Fotiao, the Ugra Pracha that I worked on, I didn't work primarily on this version, but used it for the Few Good Men book. They too did a remarkably good job and were immensely successful. This text has a commentary that's also, many of the commentaries are lost. It was quoted down through the centuries. And of course, Kangmeng Xiang, his much nicer text, was quoted, and I recently discovered it serves as the basis for a Chinese apocryphon that's perhaps the most misogynist thing ever written about Buddhist nuns. It looks like it masquerades as a translation, but it contains huge pieces copied from Kangmeng Xiang's text. So they use some of Kangmeng Xiang's Buddha biography, then they plug in their own terrible stuff about women, then they put in more of Kangmeng Xiang, then they plug in, again, extra things that need to be done to keep these females in line. So it's quite an amazing text. I hope to write something about that before long. But being plagiarized, which is what's going on here, is one form of popularity. So all of these pioneering efforts seem to have really made an impact. And I'll close by saying that I think we can take some encouragement from that, even if our work is not always elegant, not always beautiful. It reminds me a bit, to go back to my roots in Indiana, of 1968, when I was a sophomore, and we were in the midst of the Vietnam conflict. And of course, as someone has already mentioned, that made the world very easy to parse for us. Everything Asian was good, everything Western was bad. And so the Introduction to Asian Religions course had, I won't say standing room only, it closed every semester at 270 students with a waiting list. And I'm not going to give the name here. The professor was terrible. He was such a boring lecturer. And to make matters worse, before we could read anything about any of these Asian religions that we were all so hungry to grasp, we had to read Eliade's The Sacred and Profane in its entirety. And people didn't drop the course. So I think there's a distant parallel to the Chinese case here. There was an appetite. People were willing to tolerate less than elegant literary works. They were eager to hear about Buddhism. They were eager to read these translations. And so, as I say, I think we can continue to strive for as wonderful and nuanced and, of course, careful translations as we possibly can. But if we don't always manage, there'll be an audience anyway. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So there's time for questions. We've got about 20 minutes. There are 2 microphones that are going to be passed around. So please stand up and tell us who you are when you ask your question.
I'm Judith Simmerbrand from Naropa University, and just wanted to say how much many of us are grateful to your teaching Tibetan the first summer of Naropa, 1974, where we, some of us here started with you then. So,
thank you, Judith. That was such a great experience, and it's been such a pleasure to run into some of you again here. Wow.
I wanted to ask a question about that quote from the Vinaya about the importance of using local language. And as I remember, that quote goes on to say that it was important to use the local language, but not conform to local usage. And at least that quote is quoted in the Majjhima Nikaya with that full length of the quote, using a local language, but not conforming to a local meaning. And that's been such a provocative quote for me over the years of thinking of the responsibility of interpreting Buddhist texts because of how it is that Buddhism used so many local words, but developed new meanings for those words. And just how that's a kind of challenge for the scholar and translator and practitioner in terms of understanding how the Prakrits began to tweak meanings of local words. So I wanted to ask you about that. Perhaps that was not something that you saw or remembered from the Vinaya quote, but it's something that stayed with me for many years, and it has really caused me to think a lot about how Buddhist languages developed.
Thanks, Judith. If you could, at some point, give me the specific reference. You said Majjhima Nikaya?
Majjhima Nikaya,
okay.
yes.
And
I'll find the reference and send it to you.
Okay, thank you. That is a different story than the one I was referring to. The Chanda's business and the 2 Brahmin brothers is a story that occurs in the Pali Vinaya, the monastic royal section, rather than in the Sutta section. So, and it was what you're talking about in the Majjhima Nikaya was not discussed in the Indological sources that I read that were talking about how to understand Chandas and so forth. But I'd like to look at that to see to what extent it lines up with this, to what extent are they in fact engaging the same issues. So I'd very much appreciate it if you could give me chapter and verse. I'm pretty sure the word chandas does not appear there, so I can't go into the computer and search that way. But
do you have any reflections on the quote, the notion of not conforming to local meaning?
I have to look at it in context.
Okay,
I'd like to see what's going on in that
All
sutta.
right, thank you very much.
And, of course, what the Pali words are and
Yes.
all that fun stuff.
Okay, thank you.
But thank you for bringing that up. I mean, just one PS to that. The Buddha was famous for taking known terms and changing them. What's an Aryan? It's not somebody who's born from this certain ethnic group. What's a Brahmin? A true Brahmin is not a Brahmin by birth, he's a Brahmin by deeds, and so forth. So there are lots of cases where that could be implied, but I'm not sure that's what's meant in the passage, so I'll look forward to seeing that. Thanks.
My name's Ken McLeod. I very much enjoyed your talk and really illustrating to me the value of scholarship in finding out what went on in previous ages and how we're struggling with the same issues. I found that very, very helpful. My question is, noting if I understood you correctly, in Sri Lanka, that the developing a writing down scriptures for the first time. I wondered if you, to me that implies that there was some kind of institutionalization going on in Buddhism, and I wondered if you might comment on that.
I suspect there was, certainly there was the institution of the local Nikaya that was sponsoring it, the ordination lineage. I don't recall offhand if there was government sponsorship. It wouldn't surprise me. But I am not a specialist in the Pali historical chronicles, so I'd have to go back and look for that. But your question brings up a bigger issue that I didn't, in fact, have time to touch on, and that is how exceptional it is, not just to write down teachings, but to translate a canon. The Chinese did it. The Tibetans did it. Who else did it? They didn't do it in Southeast Asia. There is no Thai, Burmese, Cambodian canon. There's a Pali canon in the local scripts. They didn't do it in Japan. They didn't do it in Korea. The Korean Buddhist canon is in Chinese. The Tibetans did it. The Mongols did it, but then stopped using it and started writing things in Tibetan later on. It's exceptional to translate a canon, and this relates directly to the issue you brought up of sponsorship. I'm tempted to think, on the analogy of it takes a village to raise a child, perhaps it takes an empire to translate a canon. Yes, resources, huge amount of resources. I don't mean translating individual texts, but translating something this massive. And obviously the Tibetan project was done at the height of the Tibetan Empire. It was begun then. So all across Central Asia, they didn't do it until very late. So we have these Chinese, Tibetan, and Pali as the hegemonic languages, hegemonic canons, all done with major local sponsorship, it seems. So thank you very much for bringing that up.
Is it working? Yes.
Okay.
I'm also your student from 1972, I think, Religions in the East, so I know what you're saying is correct.
You remember that class, huh?
Yeah, I remember it very well also. I wonder, Chandas, because I remember reading in a very old article by Sylvain Levy, I think, that actually it was the chanting style. I like to think of it as cantillation and using an analogy from Judaism, but it's more like singing than metrics. Sometimes it's translated as metrics, right? But nowadays metrics in poetry is not quite the singing style, the melodious sounding singing style like Brahmins actually used to chant. And I think the Buddhist concern, wasn't it, that when people will hear it, they won't think that it's Brahmins chanting. They'll recognize that it's something else. He was trying to keep a little separatism from the the Brahmins, I think.
Well, certainly he was trying to do that. That's a good point. That's one of the arguments that's been made about the meaning of chandas. And I think Brough, when he discussed this at a later point, certainly treats that as one of the possibilities. And I think that it's very likely that what the brothers were asking for was that kind of thing. Let's do it in a beautiful chanting, singing style. But then when the Buddha turns around and says no, and emphasizes local languages, it implies, at least to my ear, that this chanting or singing style was associated with a non-vernacular language, which it would have been at that time. So Levi's point is always important to consider, and I think that's a very likely meaning of it, where the term started. Thanks, Dan.
Sorry, so my name is Gendun Rapsel. I teach Tibetan language at Indiana University. So here's
Can you wave your hand? I don't see what, oh, you're in the back. Okay, great. Thank you.
So my question is kind of, I think maybe crazy question here. And when the Tibetan Lamas given teachings at the beginning, they chant one verse, which was, I think, from the Sangpo-Chöpe Molam Chijebo, Sancho Molam. And in that prayer is the Buddha is giving instructions, teachings, all languages, Lai Ketan, Lui Ketan, and the Nujing, all languages he given teachers. And plus, you know, my early years, I think when we engage in Tibetan debate is that does Buddha speak Tibetan language? That questions comes a lot. And I think monks don't dare to say that Buddha doesn't speak English, Tibetan, I'm sorry. So, I mean, my questions bring back this, you know, when you look in Buddha, if you really believe something in Buddhism tradition, something you believe in the enlightenment system or knowing system. So that means, you know, you kind of removing all ignorance, such as, so all those kind of things, then I think naturally Buddha speaks all languages. And also Buddha has the ability that when he speaks in one language, his ability is that all people, audience, all kind of dialogue, people will understand it correctly. So what is your take on this? So that is my question.
Thank you. Very interesting question. If you bring in omniscience, it solves a lot of problems. And it creates a lot more problems. There's a story in the Pali Canon about a monk who had renounced the world on his own, kind of gone off and wanted to meet the Buddha and be ordained by him, but is wandering around looking for alms. And the Buddha winds up staying in a potter's shed with him, this in the Majjhima Nikaya, this story. And the monk doesn't recognize the Buddha, of course, he's never seen him. And they're sitting up at night meditating, and the Buddha's looking at this guy and saying, yeah, he's doing really well. And so, you know, who's your teacher? Oh, I'm a devotee. I went forth in the religion of the Buddha. Oh, have you ever met the Buddha? No. Would you know him if you saw him? No. So the Buddha says, oh, well, I'll teach you some things. He doesn't say who he is. And as the Buddha gets well into these teachings, which are actually about the 6 elements, the 6 dhatus, the monk realizes his error. He realizes he's actually in the presence of the Buddha. And he apologizes and, you know, says, oh, I really offended you by calling you friend. You know, I didn't know who you were. Can I get ordained? The Buddha says, yes, but you got to go get a robe and a bowl. So the guy goes into the city the next day. Does anyone know this story? What happens to the poor monk? He gets gored to death by an ox. Later versions of the story bring in the Buddha's omniscience, that the Buddha actually knew it was the last day of this man's life. And so he flew, in some of the versions, to the town where the potter's shed was so he could spend the night with this monk and teach him and bring him up to a high level of realization before he died. So omniscience causes problems when the Buddha seems not, if you read the story one way, the Buddha's order, instructions to go get a robe and a bowl caused the guy's death. He went into town, he got killed by an ox. So then the next commentarial layer deals with that by saying that, in fact, the Buddha's omniscience was why they met. So omniscience is, I would say, a two-edged sword. And I haven't really answered your question, but there are many texts that say what you said, that the Buddha knew many, many languages. So those who want to look at it that way can certainly appeal to those. Thanks.
I have kind of two questions. One is, the chanda. In the Sanskrit, there are lots of chanda, and this the Buddha Charitra and things like that written in chanda. In one chanda, the whole chapter is very beautiful but very difficult to understand for common people. So could it be that the Buddha didn't allow them to put his teachings in chanda because it would be too difficult for the ordinary people to understand? And that's one question. And another question is that in Tibetan tradition, we always talk about the four languages, the Sanskrit and Prakrita and Avabrasha and things like that. So can you explain something about those?
I'll give it a try. Let me start with the first one about how the common people could understand. Of course, the Buddha Charita is thought to date from roughly 5 centuries after the time of the Buddha, in a period where beautiful Sanskrit was starting to be used by some Buddhists some of the time. It may be that one of his concerns was anything too literary would not be understandable, as you're suggesting. The reference really being in an earlier Vedic context here could well be that if they made it anything like Vedic Sanskrit in their singing and chanting, that it would not have been understandable. What's clearest about that passage in the Vinaya story is that the Buddha's opposite option that he encouraged was precisely to speak local vernaculars, which includes not making it fancy, I think, not making it high register literary. As far as the list of languages that you mentioned, that is a later list. Upabharamsha in particular is something that dates from a later period. So it doesn't map on well to the Prakrits of the time of Ashoka or the time of the Buddha himself. But it's another snapshot in time of linguistic multiplicity. So I don't remember the fourth one on that list. Oh, yeah, right. So real down, low-level kind of language in the pecking order of what's in that list. So do you know the date of that list? Does anybody know when that first appears?
Well, in Tibetan sources, every time, you talk about the teaching starts with, first teaching starts with, the reciting this, what he was saying. Like every time a teaching starts, you have to recite this, that I give these teachings in the language of the Devas and, all this. And then they talk about, the source of the teachings, and then they talk about these four different kind of group of languages. And that's kind of a very traditional way of, starting a teaching almost every time in Tibetan system. And another thing, I just wanted to say that, this, of course, my Sanskrit and my Pali are very bad, but as, just when you look at it, it sounded as if, Pali is just a simplified version of Sanskrit.
Well, all of the Prakrits are, in the same sense that the Romance languages are simplified versions of Latin. They've lost a lot of the distinctions and case endings. Some of them have lost the neuter gender. They're simpler than Sanskrit, no question. But Sanskrit at one time was also a vernacular. So these are just the offspring languages, which do what apparently language evolution normally does, which is to simplify, at least at the point, in the stories that I'm aware of. I don't know if the opposite ever happens, that languages complexify at a later period in their history. But yes, they're Pali, Gandhari, what we know about the various Prakrits that we see in Ashoka's inscriptions are all linguistically simpler than Sanskrit was. So, thank you.
This is Janet Yazzo back here.
Hi, Janet.
This is just something that occurred to me. Did I hear you right to say that when the Pali texts were written down, that was the first time in South Asian culture that the great religious scriptures were committed to writing?
We thought it was the first time until they started digging up first century manuscripts in Gandhari.
Oh, Buddhist, but I'm
Buddhist.
talking about what about like the Upanishads and all of the rest of Indian literature?
Upanishads are very late. My understanding, if there's an Indologist here who can correct me, I think it was done very late under 15th century, maybe, under Persian influence.
That's the
Does
first
that
time
sound right?
it's committed to writing.
Yes, committed to writing, and the Vedas even later, under British pressure, is my understanding.
So again, forgive me if someone has written about this, but this is an enormously striking fact that it's Buddhism that is the first one to take this, talk about translation from an oral tradition to a system of writing.
Yes.
Is like enormous, and it's just something to think about, that's Buddhism that introduces that to the entire South Asian religious civilization, and what that says about, as you yourself implied, the difference between having an oral tradition and having a written textual tradition, what that means culturally, what that means in terms of the, availability and status of knowledge and so on. I mean, that's just like an enormous contribution that Buddhism makes in
Yes.
that part of the world.
It is.
It's worth thinking about further.
What's interesting to go along with that, I think it is enormous. And the Gandhari guys, the folks doing this painstaking deciphering of those texts, do really emphasize that these are not just the oldest Buddhist texts, they are the oldest Indian written texts, aside from inscriptions on rock. And it's an enormous innovation. I would emphasize just that mostly that innovation got exported, and it trickled back into India then. So ultimately, of course, we do find Sanskrit manuscripts and Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit manuscripts. But you're exactly right, it was the Buddhists who did this. And it was the Buddhists on the fringes, outside the Brahmanical heartland, who did this. So it's a kind of combination, export to the edges, do this radically new thing, and then that idea that you can write down a religious text and not be struck by lightning trickles back in to the subcontinent and then is picked up by other people. But the Brahmanical tradition was very resistant to it for a very long time. So yeah, it's an amazing breakthrough in terms of making this available to people.
We have to stop. It's 10:30 and we have a tea break. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.